Are the gateway tapes a tool to expand consciousness or control it? If you attended the Gifted and Talented program in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, or if you remember hearing the gateway tapes in school, you're going to want to watch this video all the way till the end, because today we're getting into the history of the tapes and the long-term effects that it could have had on children. Today we're going to go as far back as the Roswell crash in New Mexico in the 1940s, because that seems to have changed a lot, especially when it comes to our government and the creation of the CIA. The CIA has long been interested in the expansion, or shall I say, controlling of consciousness. And it was formed in the 1940s, right after World War II. This also was the same time that Robert Monroe was beginning his preliminary research on the gateway tapes and having his own out-of-body experiences. By the 70s and the 80s, the CIA had already done their own assessment of the gateway tapes, in which they talked about the exploration of consciousness, the effects that the tapes could have on out-of-body experiences and remote viewing, and also the holographic universe. The tapes were able to study consciousness outside of time and space. So you can see why the government may have had an interest in them, especially around the Cold War, when they were interested in psychic espionage. So by the 70s and 80s, the tapes were more mainstream and more people were likely using them. By the 90s, they were already somewhat studied. And if you were in the Gifted and Talented program, you may have even remembered listening to them during routine hearing tests. I do want to make a disclaimer here and say I could find no evidence that they were actually playing us the gateway tapes during these tests. And there is something called Schema, in which the brain may remember a similar tone, frequency, or voice pattern and associate it with something they listened to in childhood. For example, if you were going down the gate rabbit hole and you heard Monroe's voice, even if you didn't hear him in childhood or listen to the tapes, your brain could have remembered a similar tape or experience that you had that sounded an awful like Monroe's, which is not uncommon due to the types of educational tools they had in the 80s and 90s. It was also common for elementary schools to incorporate nap time, which usually happened right after lunch. And from what I could tell, there's no documented research that every single classroom had the same exact curriculum. In fact, curriculum in elementary schools was based on a combination of federal government funding, private and nonprofit sectors, state and local government, local school districts, and largely came down to what the teachers themselves wanted to implement in their own classrooms. So as I said, there's no documented evidence that we actually all listened to the gateway tapes. However, it is quite possible, because when we go back to what the CIA was studying all of those years before they got a hold of the gateway tapes, they had already developed quite an interest in psychedelics and how they affected the mind, especially when they were doing MK Ultra programming, but it dates back even earlier to Project BLUEBIRD and Project ARTICHOKE. Many people think that MK Ultra continued even after it was shut down, onto something called Project Monarch, or Monarch Programming. Cisco Wheeler and Fritz Springmeier came out with a book in the 90s called The Illuminati Formula Used to Create an Undetectable Total Mind-Controlled Slave, as well as a few other books that explained Monarch Programming in detail. And what's disturbing about those books is that they mentioned someone named Michael Aquino, who is not only involved in our military and co-authored a book called From PSYOP to Mind War, but he was also in a way connected to the Gifted program. So what I mean is that his mother was allegedly in one of the longest run studies for Gifted programs in the early 1900s. And he was connected to a guy named Lewis Terman, who made the IQ test and who was largely interested in the study of eugenics. So in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, before the World War started, before the CIA even formed, there was already an interest in gifted minds and potential grooming of these minds by secret societies and organizations that are rumored to run the country. For example, the 13 Bloodlines Illuminati book, which I have not personally read, but you can probably find that online if you're interested. And I've heard people reference it before, and it mostly talks about the family names that are associated with these ancestry lines. And you may notice that these names also pop up in our culture a lot, especially when it comes to the education system. So what I find interesting about all of this is how it all seems to tie together, and it all seems to be connected by this interest in the exploration of consciousness, which is what the gateway tapes are primarily used for. Now, I don't think there's anything negative particularly about Robert Monroe or his intentions in creating the tapes and the technology behind the tapes, which is called Hemi-Sync technology. And if you're not familiar with Hemi-Sync technology is when there's different frequencies played in each ear. So it creates a difference and it puts your brain in a certain brain wave state, like delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. So this is called brainwave entrainment, and the effects on children may be a lot different than the effects on adults. Again, I could not find any research that actually documented the effects on children under the age of 7 years old, and this is where it gets really interesting. Because children's brains are especially plastic, which means that they're very easy to make suggestions to, they are still developing, they are very sensitive around that age. Using brainwave entrainment to specifically train the brain into certain brain states can have long-term effects on children that they may or may not have known about when and if they were using these tapes in the classroom. Again, I say if because I could not find documented evidence that they were actually using the gateway tapes themselves, and it is possible that they could have used tapes that were inspired by Monroe's work since he was well known back then. So if they had listened to brainwave entrainment tapes though, the effects could be as followed. Putting children in induced states of theta and delta could have the effect of dissociation, or keeping the child in altered states of consciousness for longer than they're able to, making it harder for them to come back down to reality and focus. So in other words, these children may be trapped in a constant state of daydreaming. Playing a frequency like beta or gamma, on the other hand, could leave children hypervigilant and anxious and restless. ADHD, anyone? What I find interesting about the hyperactivity though, is that Blair White recently did an episode with UFO attorney Danny Sheehan, and he mentioned a secret gate classroom at Northrop Grumman and how they were using children to telepathically pilot the UFOs because the military could not pilot them because they did not have the right brain state. And I remember listening to some other podcast where they were talking about UFO technology and how there was certain protection mechanisms built into the technology to avoid having people who are primarily in states of fear use their craft. So you had to be in the right brain state to operate this kind of technology, which made children the perfect vessel for it, allegedly. But in that episode, he also mentions how they would put the kids on Ritalin because it seemed to help them be in the right state of mind to pilot these crafts. So my question is this something that all of our military was somehow studying? The effects of Ritalin on children, or were they trying to program a generation of children to be in hyper restless states of consciousness? Well, I would ask why they might want that. And if we want to get dark and go down the rabbit hole, we could draw the connection between Monarch Programming and Satanism, and how Monarch Programming talks about programming children with demonic altars. So a lot of Fritz Springmeier and Cisco Wheeler's work focused on this idea of programming minds from a very young age and putting them on certain paths. And I have done several other videos about Monarch Programming, especially how it relates to gifted children, because what I found on my channel through hearing everybody's testimony from Gate is that it seems an awful lot like Monarch slaves. as far as programming children with high intelligence, like an IQ of 130 or higher. Coming from a family involved with military intelligence agencies, different religious organizations, I won't name any, but if you know, you know. And their interest in programming children from a young age at 18 months or under to be on certain paths. And I can only use myself as an example to say that when I was in the gifted and talented program, they were very big on giving me opportunities to perform in school plays. I often had the lead in the school play, and I was even ushered by my GATE teacher to be in a pageant for young women. It was not a beauty contest, apparently, it was a leadership contest. But that's the one memory I have of the gifted program, and I just find it interesting after reading this Monarch literature about how they had a personality test that they did on children, allegedly at 18 months old, and tried to decide whether they would funnel the children into military, coding, intelligence agencies, psychic espionage, Hollywood entertainment, etc. The other thing I find extremely interesting about GATE kids remembering their experience some 30 years later is that a lot of the GATE kids ended up neurodivergent, but also having some kind of psychic abilities, myself included. Do you think it's any coincidence that I grew up to be a remote viewing psychic? Maybe. But after learning about the Gateway tapes and what they were studied for, it seems like too much of a coincidence. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was programmed to learn those skills at a young age, whether that was a conscious programming or a side effect they really didn't know much about. So again, I'm not blaming any of these organizations for the long-term effects that the Gateway tapes or Brainwave entrainment may have had on children. I'm just saying it's not well documented or studied. So that means that either the information was wiped out and not saved, that it's being intentionally hidden from us, or that they were never used at all. What do you think? The other thing I really wanted to touch on is how most schools had nap time in elementary school. I mentioned this earlier about schema memory and how we can definitely hear something in adulthood that may sound oddly familiar to something we heard in childhood, and we can associate the pacing of a slow hypnotic voice with something we hear in adulthood and make that connection in our brain to kind of have a memory of something that maybe didn't really happen, but something that was vaguely familiar. So we kind of made up that memory in our minds. But the other thing to note is that during nap time, teachers often played guided meditation tapes, or they played music that would put children in a light state of hypnosis. Now, part of the reason they did this was to regulate the energy of the classroom and stress management skills that children may not have otherwise had at home. So this was part of regular curriculum for most schools back then, and may even be used today still. Mindfulness techniques and having quiet time in school. But my question, especially if they were already studying consciousness and may have had plans as far as Monarch programming goes for at least some of the students that were gifted, could they have intentionally used nap time as a way to implant suggestions and ideas into the children's minds? I've also done an episode about GATE kids opening a portal. That episode was crazy because when I was talking about Montauk Point and CERN and Project Looking Glass, I was getting chills the whole time, almost like it was spiritual confirmation that GATE kids really did open a portal, and they may have consciously tried to do that. But again, all of my research from GATE has led me down different rabbit holes, and I have not been able to find conclusive evidence that we all even had the same curriculum. In fact, if you watched my GATE curriculum episode, you may have already heard me say that when I looked into the curriculum at my elementary school, I saw that each gifted kid has their own curriculum and their own education plan, which I think, again, is very interesting and could kind of be loosely related to Monarch programming, except, again, I don't know if these teachers involved are really in cahoots consciously with any of these organizations. Because as I've discussed in many videos, this Monarch programming could have been something that was done on a large scale and likely was. As I mentioned about Michael Aquino being in our military, and co-authoring a book called From PSYOP to Mind War, there was a clear interest by the CIA and our own government in mind wars and psychological warfare. And this was big in our history in the 1940s and 50s when other countries were using children as psychic spies. So it is also a possibility that they were experimenting on an entire generation of American children and trying to program certain individuals who may have already had the skills or help them develop the skills to grow up to be psychic spies. So let me know in the comments what you think about the tapes. Have you used them in adulthood? Do you like them? Did you get a weird feeling about them? Because the last thing I will add is that some people do have a very visceral reaction to the tapes. They may feel sick, they may feel anxious, they may feel uncomfortable when they hear Monroe's voice. And that may not be related to the actual tapes themselves, but like I was mentioning about Schema, it could be relationship to something else they heard in childhood or memories associated with pain, trauma, and dissociation. And maybe that is one of the reasons why they feel uncomfortable when listening to the tapes again. Another reason people may feel uncomfortable is it could be an intuitive thing, and we could intuitively recognize that there may be some subliminal messaging in there. Again, keyword may. We don't know. We do have a good idea that subliminals are hidden in pop music, pop culture, movies, TVs. So it isn't that far-fetched to think that because the CIA had their hands in Monroe's work, that they may have implemented some of this stuff in it. But again, I'm not saying that or making accusations. I'm just saying maybe it's a possibility. But there are many people who absolutely love the tapes, and it has helped many people expand their consciousness and develop the tools to do so. So I'm not for a second telling anyone not to listen to the tapes. I just wanted to share this information with you so you can make your own decisions and see how it feels for you. And if you need help developing your intuition or discernment, I do have an ESP development and remote viewing mastery course available in my description. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, I do also offer astrology readings, human design readings, and remote viewing tarot sessions, as well as free tools like fear inventory and belief system and 21-day habits tracker that will help you clear out your energy vessel so you can have better access to your own intuition and discernment. So thanks for watching this video. Let me know in the comments if you remember listening to the tapes, if you have any evidence where you actually saw that you were really listening to the tapes. Share it with us so we can make sense of our past as gate kids together. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.